First, I was born in the 70s, so I believe, and according to the pictures I found, my parents were hippies, so that's why they gave me this name, Billy. And also, my family is from Germany, so that's why I'm Greff. And also, it's important to mention that I'm from the south of Brazil, so sometimes I have to stress that, because people always have that image of people on the beach and samba and stuff, so I'm from the south. I'm closer to tango than to samba, to be fair, because we live in an environment called Pampas, which means that you have Rio Grande do Sul, a big river of the south, which is my state, Argentina and Uruguay. And we are basically the same people. We drink the mate, the tea, and we were all Indians, the same branch of Indians there before Spanish and Portuguese people invaded and killed the people who were living there 500 years ago. So now that you know a bit more about me, I'm going to talk about the research we are going to be seeing today. So the research I'm going to present today is the result of my PhD studies, which I took at Loughborough University in the UK. I was already a lecturer at the Federal University of Rio Grande in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil. Then I went to England, spent 4 years there, studied there, taught a bit, Loughborough University and Nottingham Trent University for 1 year. And I have to mention, I was funded by CAPES, which is the federal agency for higher education in Brazil. I prepared the presentation so we could talk about global challenges, so specifically big projects impact in local communities, but also paying attention to Sustainable Development Goals from UN, especially 11, which is about, we're going to talk about cities and environment. And of course, my research was in Porto Alegre, the capital city of Rio Grande do Sul, my state in Brazil, and the perceptions of residents that were affected by the main project in that main project related to the FIFA 2014 World Cup. Okay, so my name is Billy, and I have already told you a bit about me, and I wanted also to tell you about this book. I have just got the message from the publisher that the book's out now, or it's not out, it's in pre-sale now. So the research we are going to see is in the book, and even I was telling Katka as well, for some of you maybe the most interesting part of the research is not going to be presented today, but it is in the book in areas as security or education, and we are going to talk about that at least a bit later. So the overview of the presentation today is that we are going to take a look on globalization and sport mag events, mainly on the political economy side of globalization. We are going to be discussing policies related to land rights and adequate housing in Porto Alegre, inspired by the happenings of the 2014 FIFA World Cup, and specifically about the impact of the World Cup according to the perceptions of those who were affected by the event in Porto Alegre. We will also try and collate this experience and others that I'm going to show you with the Sustainable Development Goal 11, which is make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Okay. This was a very important part of my research. I spent a lot of time reading texts that were not from my area at the beginning, at least, because when I first started my studies, I started reading literature specifically focused on sport mag events. So I read everything I could find in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And I spent years preparing my project, and in the end, I learned a bit about sport mag events and some other areas, but in a meeting with my supervisor, I told him, okay, I cannot understand bits of what's going on. For example, why are sport mag events taking place outside the economic axis of North America and Northern Europe? And we could not find that in that literature. Then I decided to go to a broader area, which is called political economy, and I found some explanations. I'm going to talk to you about them. So the first thing is that the world I was looking at was not the same world of 30 or 40 years ago. It was actually, I could find elements of globalization in that world. But globalization it is a word that has been used, a term or a concept that has been used for different matters and with different approaches. So I decided to take a more specific look at that. And then I found out that one very specific and special dimension of globalization is related to the fact that the socio-economic system actually managed to become global. So it's called global capitalism. Then I read a lot of a guy called William Robinson and the other one called Leslie Sklair and Istvan Metzeros. So then I managed to find a few of the characteristics of this global capitalism. So the first one is that to go global, capitalism had to change a few of its features, and one of them is that financial capital became the most important type of capital. Okay, let's go with that. I spent some time there to understand what that meant. I guess the easiest way to understand that is try and understand what happened right after the Second World War. The Second World War was a very disruptive happening of the last century. And then in trying to organize the world economy right after the World Cup, or even during the World Cup, no, the World War, sorry. Even during the World War, people started to rearrange the world economy. So one of the biggest changes of that time is that because the economic axis had changed from Northern Europe to the United States, they had to find a way to negotiate among the states that were involved, and then they tried to find a specific value for things in general. So they put that on gold. Well, that's history, yeah. And another characteristic is that in order to rebuild, especially Europe, governments, the state, and also the elites, they had to create a new type of economy, which was then named as developmentalism. And you also are going to have policies related to that that were well known in the second part of last century. The thing is that by the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, then these policies weren't important for elites anymore, so government started to change the policies. And it is very well accepted among scholars that the two most important voices of that changes were Margaret Thatcher in the UK and in the United States, Ronald Reagan. That's when neoliberalism comes in, and then you have this change, this more general change. The thing is, inside capital, or within those who have money, there was also a change. So that money that would go to factories, plants, jobs, would now go into finance and the financial market. That was a very important change. So within the capitalist class, let's say that with classical terms, they changed a lot. Yeah. So, like in Brazil, we have even a word to refer to this type of people who had money, and they would have land, they would have money to invest in development projects. They call them coronéis, so which means that they are not military, but they have the power. So this guy is not in power anymore in Brazil. Now it is a good-looking guy who speaks 2 or 3 different languages and play with money just like he plays with video games. So he put money in this company or that company. He's not actually worried about jobs that may or may not come or leave his city, state, or even his country. So the boundaries were blurred. So this was the first change that we observed from the study of global capitalism. The other thing is that this internal faction of the bourgeoisie also became global. As I said, people speak different languages, they travel, they know each other, they go to the same places, for example, the best schools in the world, or they meet in Aspen, they do the same things, they are more alike than the elite before them. Of course, and then we mentioned that the broader policies were represented for us as neoliberalism. So the translation of these changes into policies. So what does this change have to do with sport mag events? So the first thing is that I wanted to explain this image here. I don't know if you know them, but this guy who is kissing is Jerome Valk. At the time of my research, he was the general secretary of FIFA, and he was a very important man. And now he's forgotten because he was corrupt, and then they found out, and then he disappeared. This guy here is Ricardo Teixeira, former head of the Brazilian Football Association, who is also now at home, because if he puts his foot outside home, he's going to jail. He spent some time in the United States because he was facing some problems with justice in Brazil. But then, in the same scandal with FIFA, they found out about him, so he had to leave United States. And now every time justice asks him to answer anything, he gets sick. And then his doctors just send something, he's there. But at the time of the World Cup, these were the most important people in Brazil, and maybe 2 of the most important people in the world. They were playing with tons of money, and from the picture you can see that their relationship wasn't actually just economic. That's why I chose that. But then what they were doing is related to what I just talked to you about. They were exploring the new boundaries of global capitalism. One of them is that global capitalism has this tendency to territorial expansion. So first I observed that in companies. So for us now it is even natural to see, for example, when we buy shoes, that the shoes are from a brand from the United States, but they were made in Taiwan or Brazil or somewhere like that. So that happened in between the 80s and the 90s when territorial expansion started. But it was not just a territorial expansion, it was also a fraction of the productive process, which means that parts of the productive process can happen somewhere and others cannot. One good example of that, and everybody always use that, is that computers are always built in different parts of the world. Most of the companies do that. But chips are made in 2, 3, or 4, 5 maybe countries. Why is that? Because anyone in Brazil is able to, I don't know, assemble a keyboard, but you have to have the knowledge to produce a chip. Even the material from the chip is not from the United States or Ireland, for example. It comes from Africa and South America. But factories of computers are always using this kind of arrangement, which Saskia Sassen called assemblage, global assemblage. Yeah. So another part of this process is that instead of having stable jobs and employees from the companies started to outsource part of their productive process. It also happened with sport mag events. So, as I'm going to show you in a few seconds or minutes, sport mag events left the Northern Europe and the United States. They also started to fraction the productive process, which means that FIFA and the IOC started to get more serious about their controlling role and started to give the productive process to secondary actors. And these 99% of the times produce a type of development which is known in the literature as uneven and combined development, which means that depending on the level of development of the actors involved, they are going to get from the process different outcomes. So, for example, if I am from a very developed country and Katka is from an underdeveloped country, the outcome of the process in which we are partners are going to be split differently between us. I am from the developed country, I'm going to get more from the process, and Katka is going to get less. So this is the theory behind the first part of my studies. At this point, I started to think and even be challenged by my supervisor to show how that actually works within sport mag events. So then I started to try and figure out a way to show that, to display how that actually works. One of the reports I have read during the theoretical part of the study was the report on wealth published by Credit Suisse. It is a very interesting report. They publish every year a report on the wealth, and they say where the money is, but not just the money, the wealth, the real thing. So their report is like that. In red here, the United States and Canada, Northern Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan and South Korea is where the money is in red. Then you have the green part, which is the developing part of the world, and the blue part, which is the really poor part of the world. Then I said, okay, if my theory is right, and I presented for you just the best part of the theory. Of course, after this, I had to change a few things because some things weren't exactly as I thought. But I thought, okay, if my theory is right, I have to be able to represent sport mag events in this map here. So then I asked a designer, a friend of mine, to design this map here, which I'm going to explain to you now. So this map shows in green and red the developed and developing world, and also every sport mag event. The image is not so clear here, but you see this white circle here. This is a sport mag event since 1896. So I got the first Olympics in 1896 and the first World Cup, Football World Cup in 1930, and then I started to point them there in the map. And then I started to see other tendencies, more specific tendencies. Of course, visually, we can see that most of the sport mag events took place in Northern Europe, and some in North America, then some in South America, and other places as well. But the tendencies I talked about. So let's just see the World Cups first. The World Cups from 1930 to 2002, okay, here, a lot of them took place outside the economic axis. Why? Mostly because Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay were very strong in football, so they could demand FIFA to hold football World Cups in their country. And also because in 30, when the World Cup started, it was right before the Great War, so then afterwards they had to hold a few World Cups in South America because Northern Europe wasn't able to hold them. But then even more interesting, of course, even more interesting that after 2002, we will have 80% of football World Cups outside the economic axis, in places like Qatar, Russia, Brazil, South Africa. Very, very curious. Then you have the Olympics. The Olympics are even more exclusive. Only 2 for more than 1 century, only 2 Olympics took place outside the economic axis, and then this century, 60% of them outside the economic axis. It's a big change as well. So that tendency of territorial expansion is also manifested here in sports mega events according to this map, this analysis, which took me some time to go through, and I'm very happy that I ended up with this image which kind of summarized stuff. But then, oh no, I'm gonna show you that now. But then I thought, if I can show that in this way, so visually, I can also maybe translate that into numbers. Yeah. So I can make the discussion in between the concepts and the even more real consequences of sport mega events, or as I said, as I call them, the sport mega events tour through the global south. And then I started it took me months to find sources to find how much was spent by governments in sport mega events, how much FIFA and the IOC would get from sport mega events, how much of the money spent in sport mega events would go to construction companies and also security companies. I remember that somebody said that it studies security. Yeah? So it was very interesting for me to see that for studying security studies, let's say like that, there is also a change within security in the past, not a few years, at least in the discourse. So we're gonna talk about that later, but the main argument for increasing of the cost of security within sport mega events is terrorism. Yeah. And I'm going to show you now that they spend a lot of money in that. But then afterwards, when we see everyday consequences of sport mega events, you're going to see that, at least in Porto Alegre, or at least in Brazil, the problem with security was another one. So you have this contradiction between discourse and actual things that happen. Okay, that was just an observation. So what I did is, I tried to find how much the games cost, how much the government paid for the games, how much the franchise owner, and they call that, they don't like it, but the IOC owns the Olympics and then they give it to a country. And so it is franchising, isn't it? So, and then how much was spent in construction and how much was spent in security. And then we found a few tendencies here. So importantly, we found that in developing countries, the government would spend more money. Of course, more infrastructure was needed to be built. So it is natural. That was the first one. The second one is that when you have sport mega events in the developing world, the franchise owner would get more money from the event. It's almost magical. You cannot find explanation for that. FIFA and the IOC do not tell where the money comes from. They only say how much they have. And they say things like, okay, this came from TV rights, this came from tickets, this came from, but it is almost impossible to find out. Of course, that's why they have the headquarters in Switzerland, so you cannot have access to their books. So, but at least we know the amount of money they get from each of the events, so we know that they have been getting more money from Brazil, South Africa, and Russia, and China than they get from France, England, and other places like that. So this was the basic part of the study. But then within the numbers, I tried to find out how much of that money went to the hands of the construction companies. And that is a small story, because in Brazil we have 4 big construction companies. 3 of them are the biggest 3 of the world. But these 4 are called 4 sisters. By the end of the Olympics, the CEOs of the 4 sisters were in jail. Actually now, while we speak, they are still in jail. And they are in jail because of contracts with the federal government. 90% of these contracts are related to the World Cup and the Olympics. So I started to ask myself, of course, you can understand why something like, let's say here, 91% of the money spent in the World Cup in Brazil went to their hands, because we had a lot of infrastructure to construct. But the other thing I have to ask is, do you remember the picture of Jerome Valk kissing Ricardo Teixeira? Were the presidents of the Four Sisters also kissing Ricardo Teixeira before the World Cup? Or even more importantly, were they kissing the people from FIFA when they wanted to choose in between, for example, for the Olympics, Brazil or Rio or Chicago, United States? Imagine if they give the Olympics to Chicago in the United States, they are going to build, I don't know, maybe 100 new seats in one stadium, and that's it, they have all the structure. If you give the World Cup or the Olympics to Rio, they are going to have to build hotels, roads, airport, stadiums, yeah, so they can get more money. Nobody has written about that yet, but among us here, so you cannot use that on television. I believe that, yes, they have contacted the body voters before this Olympic tour and this World Cup tour as well. And then you have security, which has been increasing throughout the whole period, but also they spend a lot of more money in security outside the economic axis, because basically they say that it is easier for terrorists to access countries outside, for example, European Union, although history has shown that acts of terrorism connected to sport mag events do not happen in the global south. They happen in the United States and Europe, even though the companies get more money from that as well, and we cannot explain that. Students, and I said this was the most boring part, but maybe I'm going to say this was the deeper part of the work, at least theoretically. Now we are going to deal with more everyday life stuff, and I believe that's going to be more interesting, even because it is a real case. So now I'm going to explain a bit of how housing was impacted by the World Cup in Porto Alegre, okay? And I'm going to tell you about the policies that were put in place. So the first thing to know about the World Cup in Porto Alegre is that the biggest impact was exactly in housing. That's maybe why we decided to go with that. First time was also a request from Catarina and Susanna. So what was the approach of the event in regards to housing? Like Mr. Zé told me in the interview that the first time he actually felt the impact of the World Cup was when the mayor of the city told them, okay, 1,600 families will have to go, and that's it. They just announced that. That was the first time he felt like, okay, now I understand what the World Cup is, and he was very emotional about that. So that was the approach the event had in relation to people living in the area that would be impacted by the construction of Tronco Avenue. I'm going to explain that later in Porto Alegre. So the organizing committee talked about that, but only on television, so they couldn't understand very well. The federal government also announced a lot of investments in Porto Alegre on television. The state government also went to a news to talk about that, but only on television. And then the city hall that was responsible for the works went to the television and also printed newspapers. That's what the residents told me. And then the residents association, worried about that, started to call for meetings. Meetings wouldn't happen at first, and then they would go door to door to call people. And some actors were absent from the process. As I said before, construction companies were very important in this process, but also real estate speculators. They were really interested in that process, basically because in general, this kind of renovation ends up in process of gentrification, and then they can get a lot of money from that. So we heard things like, okay, the city hall told me that I have to go, but someone wants to buy my house for 200,000, and the city hall wants to give me 12,000. So I'm going to stay here for a little bit longer. Who are these guys? Nobody would say, but they were speculators. And then there were other actors as well that we could not identify throughout the research, but they would always be related to the possession of the land. So it was, that's important to mention, initially confusing to residents. So people would tell them different things, and they wouldn't know who believed in. Different policies were put in place to try and help these people, let's say that way, but actually to try and solve the problem. But what problem? Not the housing problem, but the construction problem, as I'm gonna show you. Last time I've been here, Susanna called me to attention that there is a timeline or a time dimension to these policies that is important. But luckily they are in order. But what is important to mention here is that these first four were going on at the same time, more or less, but this last one only was invented after this didn't work well. I'm going to tell you why. So the first policy was called social rental. It was something like that. People wouldn't leave their houses when they were told to, and because of human rights and other processes, the police could not take them from their houses. Then the mayor invented a decree, which in Brazil is different from a law, in which they would guarantee that if you leave your house, they would give you money to pay your rent. Okay? But because it wasn't allowed, nobody would know where the money would come from. So it was very dangerous as well. For example, if Victoria would leave her house to live in a house owned by Catarina, Victoria would have to go to the city hall every month to get her check, to then pay Catarina with that check. But because I am the mayor and I don't know where the money comes from, maybe next month I won't have the money. So Victoria would go to the city hall and I would tell her, I don't have money this month. And then Victoria wouldn't have the check to pay Catarina, and then Catarina would say, okay, you have to go. So this was the first try for the mayor. It was similar to a voucher. Yeah. But then the resettlement, it was just a promise of the mayor that they would build houses for these people. But then we asked them, where are you going to build those houses? What kind of houses will they be? And they would never respond. So it was just a promise. So it was, when I started the research, it was 2014. Now we are in 2019 and the houses haven't been built yet. So it was just a promise. The mayor is not the same mayor anymore, so even the promise does not exist anymore. And then the housing bonus. The housing bonus was something like that. You leave your house and I'm going to give you money to buy another house. But the thing is that they were offering only 50 mil in Portuguese, we say, which is like very little money, 12,000 pounds. So it didn't work. Very few people took the housing bonus to leave their houses, and in 2018 I came back to the community to interview people, and I asked them, do you know anyone who left their houses, got the housing bonus, spend the money somewhere, and now live in somewhere here in the neighborhood? And I said yes. Everybody would say yes, I know him. I know Lena took the money, then she went for travels, and now she's back and she's living here, and now she's trying to get another housing bonus. because they want people just gone. It was an actual policy. It was just like buying time from people outside the neighborhood. And then if you have the documents for your house, then maybe you can go to justice. You can sue the city hall because you have the right to sue them, and then you're gonna have a market price for your house. So if you notice, on top of each of these explanations, I put like a description of the people the policies were focused on. So that those phrases came from the interviews. So I would ask them, so do you know about the social rental? For, yeah, I know. They are for poor people, and poor people, they need to go. And then, yeah, but if you have the documents for your house, maybe you can get the resettlement, but you need to leave now, because they were doing a list of people who would leave their houses, so then someday they would get new houses. But they would say, okay, but the list is going to close like tomorrow. If you do not put your name here and leave your house now, we are not going to resettle you. So. And then if you have good friends, friends in the right places, or some kind of power, then maybe you can get some money from your house, but immediately. You have to leave your house, but then you get some money. That's how they explain. And then it was quite, I would say even fun, because somebody described like that. If you are a good citizen, so the way we analyze that is that he's saying if you pay your debts and you have the documents, and so they would think of them as less than good citizens because they didn't have the money to actually get the papers from their houses. You understand that dynamics? If you are a good citizen, because you can do that, I'm not because I cannot do. Yeah, it was actually sad, to be fair. But then, when all these policies didn't work well, people gathered in the residents' association, and they actually invented this new approach to housing. It was even mentioned by the UN's it's a really big title, Special Reporter for Adequate Housing, I guess, Raquel Ronick. She even mentioned that on her Twitter. One of them even showed me, yeah, see, she likes it, because she visited there and she learned about that. So it is chave por chave, which means key for key. So I only leave my house and give you the key of my house if you give me the key of my new house. Yeah. So it is very important to mention that at this point, residents were already involved with activists, NGOs, social movements, and then together with them, they managed to think of this new policy, which in fact didn't change the whole picture, but at least stopped the city hall from telling them that they would have to leave their houses because they didn't have documents, or they were somewhere that was not legal, or things like that. They always try to get people to leave their homes. Okay. Till now, I was explaining the general picture. So we started with the more theoretical stuff, then we went to the specific case, but now we are going to talk about the research. I took the data I collected from that region. So first, it is important to mention that the World Cup in Porto Alegre was considered a sporting success, but a social failure. Why a sporting success? First, because the games in Porto Alegre were very nice. People loved them. So maybe if you watched it, you're going to remember the goal from Van Pees from Holland. The header outside the box was there, and also the first the last 16 Germany versus Algeria 2-0 second time extension was also there, and also they invented a walking path called Caminho do Gol, which means the goal path, that people would go from city center to the stadium walking, and other places they built trains and buses and things like that. And in Porto Alegre they decided to leave it that way, but to protect people, so they could walk there, and it was a really nice atmosphere. And then people from Holland invaded once, so it was painted in orange, and so it was shown in the whole world. But on the other hand, from 10 development projects that were planned and actually financed by the state, only one was finished for the World Cup, which was just a small work close to the stadium. Our case is going to focus on the main development project, the Tronco Avenue construction. I'm going to explain better now for you. So, the Tronco Avenue is a big avenue that would be constructed between town center and the start of the south zone of Porto Alegre, avoiding going through the stadium to go to the south zone. I'm going to show you a picture soon. That area that is shown here, these pictures are from 2014 and 2015. But the works started in 2012. So when I took these pictures, the works were going on for at least 3 years here. And now we are in 2019 and they haven't finished the works. Imagine living in a place like that. I even shown that to a friend of mine who lives in New York now, and she's from Greece, and she studies war. And I show her these pictures, and she said, yes, you can say that it was from war. Actually, the first time I used these images were to show my supervisor, who had challenged me to find something because I had written, okay, if you are not from Porto Alegre and you just end up there, and someone asks you what it looks like, you say it looks like a war zone. And he said, oh, Billy, do not exaggerate. The war is a very serious thing and stuff. And then I sent him the text with these pictures. We never talked about that anymore. It is sad. Here you have people organized afterwards when they decided to have that policy called Key for Key. But these are just, imagine if you live in this house, and then these people here decide to leave their house, and then next day the city hall would destroy the house. Otherwise someone else would go in. But then you're living here or here. So a lot of abandoned places, which would, according to the interviews, become places where people would go to do illegal things, basically trafficking. So this is the project for the Tronco Avenue. It to go through here, this yellow part, yeah, and you were discussing methods before, and a very interesting thing about methods. At some point, we will not have time to discuss that, but in sport mag event literature, when they assess the impact of the games, nobody can, we don't have an agreement about the universe of research. Is it the city? Is it the neighborhood? Is it the city? Is it the region, the state, the continent? Nobody knows. But at the time I was trying to figure out what to do with my research, the Porto Alegre City Hall released these images, and they are about the project. So in yellow you have the works, and in green you have the area of impact, the impact area. So then I just said, okay, you said that, so I'm going to go with you. And then I can even discuss with you later, because you have told me what is the impact area. The first time I presented this work in Porto Alegre, someone from the City Hall, not actually from the City Hall, but that worked in the project, said, yeah, but it's not exactly like that. And I said, okay, but it is your project, not mine. Yeah. And another thing that might be interesting for you, because you are lecturers, you are scholars, researchers, is that you are going to feel my pain. So I had to, after that, I asked them for numbers of how many people live there. Of course, they wouldn't give me anything, because they knew I would try and find out stuff. And they didn't know me very well, but they knew I would try and find answers for questions they wouldn't like being question being made. So I went to Google Earth and then I marked the same area. So this is that green area that we saw in the past image here. They are in different colors because it would take so much time for me to count the houses there that I would like, okay, I'm gonna have the whole day, so I would get this area. No, I only have 2 hours, so this area, this is small area. So what I have to do, I study in geography, human geography and things like that, how they estimate the number of people in an area. So it's actually, I started counting roofs. That's what was my job. If it was easy to identify that it was a house, it was a house. If it was a building, I would go to Google Earth and then would, go to Street View, then count windows, and they have mathematics for that, or maybe physics, I don't know. And then, depending on the number of windows and stuff, I would estimate the number of people living in that house. It took me 2 or 3 months to finish the work, because even I was studying sampling then after the universe. I had to sample. Then, okay, I want a strong number, so 5%. And so I had to count it back. Each of one house of each 27. So after finishing counting, I had count 3,465 residences there. So I had to count it back. 1, 2, 3, 27. So here I'll go. 1, 2, 3, 27. And then this is a map I will take with me for a data collection day. So in between 5 and 8 different surveys I would take in one day. They would take around 15, 20, 30 minutes, but then you have to convince people. They want sometimes they want to tell you about their problems. Sometimes they want to tell you about the soap opera, and of course you're not paying them, so you have to be there. So afterwards I also interviewed 5% of the sample, so 7 people. The survey form had 50 different pieces of information about identification, but specifically about 7 different areas: housing, education, security, health, public sphere performance, economy, employment, and specifically about the World Cup. We are going to take a look on the perceptions of Porto Alegre residents regarding housing, specifically housing. So as I said before, the observations took place in 2014, 15 and also 18, but the survey was taken in 2015, and some of the interviews, the free interviews, were taken in 2015, and then the interviews from the methodology were taken last year. So you already know about the situation or about housing. So they were removing people. They learned about the evictions officially, semi-officially, from television. They didn't know well, but they felt threatened by that. That was the environment I found out when I went in the neighborhood for the research. So about their identification. So they were tenants. They had possession without documents or with documents, or just occupants, how they were called. So I don't know how things specifically in Slovakia happen, but these are the categories that I created from the contact with the residents. Of course, I tested that, and I also asked from people specifically from urban studies and things like that. They said, that's it, in Brazil, that's it. So you have people who pay the rent, so the tenants, and you have people who actually possess a house. Some of them have documents, others don't. But then you have international laws that say they are the owners, so we classify them that way. And then you have other people who actually do not possess the houses, but they live in the houses. So they are called occupants. They are there. Okay. these are the numbers. We are going to go through each of these, but I'm going to give you a few seconds so you can see the type of data I was collecting. So I would ask them, anyone in your house or from your family, because I wanted the sample to be representative of people in that house and not just one person. So that's why I would ask the questions to anyone above 18 who would answer to the door. I was never alone with them. I would always have someone with me, basically students, and I would bribe them to go with me. If nobody would answer to the door, according to the methodology, I would have to go to the next door. Nobody would answer to the past door, and then 2 doors ahead, and then 2 doors behind. And if in these 5 houses nobody would answer, I would have to go home and come back another day. That never happened. Every time I went to one of those places, I found someone to answer. Basically, due to help of neighbors. I would knock at the door, oh, Jana is not home, but she's there, and then they would call her, and things happen. So I managed to collect the data. Specifically in this case of housing, the numbers were very symbolic, significant. So let's take a look at the first question. So I would ask them, did you feel, someone in your house or in your family feel threatened by removal due to the World Cup? 31% of them said yes. Imagine here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, let's say 3 of us would live for months, maybe years, every day getting out of bed thinking maybe today they are going to say, I have to leave my house. So they were living like that. So that contradicts some of security discourses, so related to terrorism, because the inner threat related to displacement and forced and violent evictions is apparently as important and perhaps more frequently materialized. And then the other thing is that related to that possibility of eviction was also the fear that the eviction would be forced, which means that they would have to leave some of their stuff behind, because they wouldn't have money or time to organize and leave the house. That part comes from the interviews. And then I also asked them, do you feel threatened by anything else? And then they would mention things like disruption, violence, disruption of mutual help networks. Maybe for us, we have work. Sometimes when we have a problem, maybe we have money to solve the problem. But in that neighborhood, they would ask for the neighborhood. So they would say, let's say, oh, my kid, he doesn't have school today, but I have to work. Then I would call Lena. Lena, can you stay with my baby? Yes, yes. Leave him here, and then it's all right. So this kind of stuff was going on there. Very importantly, 25% of the people I asked said, okay, I know someone who was evicted. And then I asked them, okay, and you know if that person left the neighborhood? And 94 of those people left the community, which means that first, they couldn't keep their own network, but they also disrupted other people's networks, because people who left, who stayed in the community, also would have problems relating to that. And it is important to mention here that this is an important aspect of SDG 11, Sustainable Development Goal 11, which is progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. So if you have a project and you want it to be related or right with the development goals, then you have to consider that your project should help to develop adequate housing and not the contrary here. And then I asked them about basic services, and 50% of them said that they were being confronted with interruptions throughout the whole period. 50%, half of them, so we are 9 here, like 4.5 of us, would every time get out of bed without, maybe without water or electricity power. I asked them if they had taken part in decision-making processes, and only 19% of them said that they were invited by the government or the city hall to take part. But the city hall put an office in the community so they could get attention there. Only 19% of the residents went to that office to discuss with them, and from those, 63% said that the service was inappropriate. So, for example, they wouldn't allow people to go in the office with their lawyer or the representative of the Residents Association. I would like to spend just a few seconds, Katka, trying to relate that to our setup here. So the first thing is, I found out about two specific points that we could relate. First one is the ice hockey, which is happening now, and also the apparently eternal talk about Winter Olympics in Slovakia, maybe together with Poland. Okay. So I asked them, is Slovakia safe? So I learned yesterday that not against Finland. Yeah. But we are not talking specifically about that. But maybe afterwards, in the afternoon, you can even tell me about some of these questions. For example, what was the impact of the event in country's economy? Yeah. What was the government participation in funding of the event? Who benefited from the event's occurrence? And how were the most vulnerable populations affected by the event? And I tried to find it, of course, in English, and I couldn't find anything about any of these issues. A curious case, when I arrived here in Bratislava, I noticed that the prices of the rooms in the hotel were like 10 times, I don't know, I'm not sure, but a lot more. And then I remember this curious case. When Rio was being chosen to represent Brazil in the bid for the 2016 Olympics, São Paulo was also trying, but they weren't so keen to have the Olympics there. Then when I started studying years after that, then I found out why São Paulo's Hotels Association did not support the bid. Because every time you get, even more in tourism literature, their journals, they do the math this way. Okay, this hotel, they have 200 rooms, and during the World Cup, they had 100% occupation, so it was great. In São Paulo, no, because they had like 80% occupation rate all the time, so they would only have 20%. And people who goes in, I don't know if you have been to Bratislava now, but it's not people who are going to go to the restaurants and...
Well, you avoid as a local, you avoid...
Yeah, they are going to drink beer and
it's hard 2 weeks not to go to the city center.
Yes, that's it, exactly. You don't go there because they are there. So that's what the people from the hotels in São Paulo were saying. We don't want them here because they are going to make a mess in our city, and they are not going to spend that much money. Maybe they don't come here and we are going to be happy that way. That one was something that I could relate with the case we have here. But also, Sport Mag events have been very identified with problems in relation to specific minorities or specific peoples in specific places. We have a few reports from different NGOs about Roma peoples in Greece, and also in Greece other peoples, not just Roma. And I know that I learned through studies and my last stay here that also a few of the Roma populations have issues in regards to being integrated within the Slovakian community. If we relate that to SDG 11, then maybe we can ask, how could a sport mag event help Slovakia regarding Roma population, integration, and then also about education and employment? to finish our part now. Sorry I had to rush. I also want to show you another case. It's going to take 3 to 4 minutes. So the first one, no, it's the same case, but it is not in Brazil and it's not in Slovakia, but it's a sport mag event as well.
Blikkisdorp means tin town. The name comes from about 2,000 one-room structures made of thin tin and zinc sheets. Blikkisdorp is a temporary relocation area, or TRA, established in 2007 by the city of Cape Town. It's supposed to be a temporary location for people with housing problems, especially homeless families. Blikkisdorp is 30 kilometers away from the city centre. People have been relocated here from all over Cape Town. They have been told very little about when they will be moved and where the upgraded permanent housing will be. Residents have been moved far away from their communities and central workplaces, many losing work, both formal and informal. In 2015, according to a survey done, 73% of residents had no formal work in the past month. The tin structures house up to 10 people. They have no in or bathroom, shower or toilet, so on average about 10 people share one outside toilet. The structure has no insulation, meaning it is either extremely hot or very cold. The tin structures are so flimsy that they are easy to break into. The lack of work and income has caused divisions in the TRA as people struggle for resources. Residents would be happy to move, but already they worry that crime and access to transport would be worse in their new location. The foundations of the residents' lives are shaky and insecure, with very little information to organise around and build a future. Without transparency around housing processes and accountability from local government, the residents live in a state of uncertainty. Community dissatisfaction with the living conditions in Blikkisdorp is high. At the beginning of 2015.
Okay, what caused Blikkisdorp? Let's take a look.
This is the part of Cape Town World Cup organisers would prefer not to showcase. Just 40 kilometres from the city centre, this is Blikkisdorp, where 3,000 people are housed after being moved on from World Cup zones with the promise of a roof over their heads. These leaky tin shacks have been built on land reclaimed from the airport. Tuberculosis and HIV are rife amongst the largely unemployed community. Blikkisdorp representative Jane Roberts lives here with her grandson and likens her living conditions to those of a concentration camp.
Everyone, they took me out from the street, they cleaned the street, and they dumped the people here. This is a dumping place for people.
She says the World Cup will only benefit FIFA and the wealthy, and only then for a short amount of time.
But I'm not supporting the World Cup because why? It's not for us, it's not for our poor people. Because why? I know when the World Cup is finished, the poor people get more poorer.
It's a view supported by the Western Cape Anti-Eviction Campaign, which claims that FIFA is merely hiring South Africa for its own benefit.
Like the money they used to build the one stadium in Greenpoint could have resolved the housing issue in the Western Cape. You know, that could have, like, really, in a good, meaningful way, resolved the land and housing issue.
The campaign will hold its own four-persons World Cup to highlight the plight of those living in squalid conditions all over the country. But despite their abject poverty, these children are still quick to show a smile as the daily struggle for existence continues under the nose of this World Cup. Valerio Vio in Cape Town for World News Australia.
Okay, this was an example from South Africa. So, thinking together about the data and the examples I gave you, I guess in the afternoon you're going to have another cases as well, and then we can discuss what can be learned from that, and of course how can you defend yourself from sport mag events in the future. I have some also more general stuff that we can take. Those who want to study that or know more about that can observe. For example, both FIFA and the IOC had to respond to the criticism on their impacts on human rights So FIFA created an advisory board just to deal with human rights. The IOC also created a kind of advisory board, but more specifically in the whole city contract, which is the contract the IOC and the city hosting the Olympics have to sign in order to produce the Olympics. They have a specific chapter now on human rights. And also you have a few NGOs and associations studying that and trying to I wouldn't say coordinate, but at least make it public, things that are happening, specifically Terre des Hommes and Children Win, which are two different organizations that are kind of producing important material as reports about that. We are going to have a fun moment after lunch. It's not a problem, it's going to take 10 minutes, and then it's going to be even better for me because I know that you are going to retain or not some of the things I said after lunch. And for now, I just wanted to thank you for your patience and your attention. Thank you.